Hi everybody, Captain Al speaking. Welcome to Training Tips designed to help make you a better, more knowledgeable flight simmer, pilot, or aviation enthusiast. Have a seat, let's strap in and stow the HUD and see what is on the horizon for today. Our briefing today will cover the Autoflight system. We'll be zeroing in on the Mode Control Panel, or MCP. Let's get started. The Mode Control Panel consists of toggle switches, push-button switches, rotary switches, windows, and a gang bar. In red, you can see that the autothrottle modes are thrust and speed. In green, you can see that the roll modes are LNAV, heading select, and heading hold. In blue, the pitch modes are VNAV, flight level change, vertical speed, and altitude hold. And in white, you can see that the approach modes are localizer and approach. We also have toggle switches for flight directors, one for the captain, one for the first officer. We have one autothrottle arm switch. And we have windows for indicated airspeed Mach, heading, vertical speed, and altitude. We have push-button switches for the left, center, and right autopilot. And we have a ganged disengage bar that is used, or one method, that is used to disconnect the autopilot. The indicated airspeed range varies from a low of 100 knots up to a maximum of 399 knots. The Mach range goes from 0.40 Mach up to 0.95 Mach. The indicated airspeed will change to Mach automatically as you transit through 0.84 Mach. And in a descent, the indicated airspeed will change from Mach to indicated airspeed as we transit through 310 knots. Most of the time you don't notice this or see it because most of the time in the climb and the descent we're in VNAV. And when we're in VNAV, the indicated airspeed Mach window would be blank since the FMC is controlling the speed. So unless you are climbing in flight level change or a mode such as that, then you would notice the change from indicated airspeed to Mach or Mach to indicated airspeed. But in reality, the mode that's most often used in the climb and especially in the initial descent phase, up closer to your cruise altitude or at a higher altitude, would be VNAV. The heading window, the heading range goes from north, or 000, all the way around back to north, or to 359 degrees would be the range of selection that you have with a heading selector. The vertical speed range would be from 8,000 foot per minute down to a maximum of 6,000 feet per minute up. The altitude range varies from a low of 0 feet to a high of 50,000 feet. So these are the low and the maximum ranges for each of these windows. Most of the time we're in single autopilot operation as we fly the airplane. Only during an ILS approach, below 1,500 feet RA, would we be in a triple channel or a multiple autopilot approach where 2 or 3 autopilots are used. If all 3 inputs to the flight control computer are operating properly, then you'll get a triple channel approach as we use the left, the center, and the right autopilot during an autoland coupled ILS approach. In all other phases, you're in single autopilot operation. Whenever you're in single autopilot operation, the ailerons and the elevators are being controlled. The only time the rudder is controlled would be during a multiple channel autopilot approach on landing below 1500 feet RA. There's a couple different ways to disconnect the autopilot. One way to disconnect the autopilot is by use of the autopilot disengage switch. On the control column, each pilot has a switch, one for the captain, one for the first officer on his left side of his control column for the captain, and the right side of the control column for the first officer. It's a little push button switch. One push will disconnect the autopilot. When you disconnect the autopilot, you'll get the master warning lights on the either side of the mode control panel, and you'll get a two-tone siren, and you'll get the autopilot disconnect message on the ICAS. Another way we can disconnect the autopilot is through the autopilot disengage bar on the mode control panel. This is a ganged bar. When normally the switch is flush with the MCP, the bottom of the mode control panel. So if you run your hand across here, it would be smooth and flush. If you take your hand and you'll pull the disengage bar down, then the gang switch will operate all three switches for the left, center, and right autopilot and disconnect all autopilots. This is an alternate way to disconnect the autopilot. The primary method is through the control column. The secondary method would be up here on the mode control panel. For FAR Part 25 airplanes, part of the stipulation of the regulations is that you have to have an alternate way to disconnect the autopilot, and this is the alternate way. During pre-flight, when you check the mode control panel, you are checking to make sure that the bar is not pulled down, that it's flush with the bottom of the MCP, and the disengage bar is not in the disengaged position. When it is in the disengaged position, you can't see it here, but there would be a little amber chevrons here. That's a visual indication that the bar is not flush with the mode control panel. If you disengage from the autopilot disengage bar, you'll get the same warnings. You'll get the master warning on both sides. You'll get the siren. You'll get the autopilot disconnect in red. And all autopilots would disconnect in that case. Let's take a look at the virtual simulator and talk about some of the aspects of the mode control panel. Again, the mode control panel is highlighted in white. You can see in this case that we have light bars illuminated for LNAV, VNAV, and the left autopilot. The light bars tell us that the selected mode has been selected, but it doesn't really tell us whether we're in LNAV or VNAV or whether an autopilot's engaged. Remember, we have to look at the FMAs, the flight mode enunciations, on the PFD, the primary flight display, in order to tell whether the modes are armed or engaged. In this case, you can see the autothrottle's in the speed mode, the roll mode is LNAV, and the pitch mode is VNAV path, telling us that we're engaged in all these modes. We can also see that the autopilot flight director engaged status tells us that an autopilot is in command. This is where we verify, and of course this is where we select, or this is what we wish to do on the mode control panel. This is what we actually have on the FMAs. So right now we're at flight level 360. We're in LNAV, we're in VNAV path, and the autothrottle is in the speed mode. Let's take a look at the flight director switches. Remember, again, we have two flight director switches, one for the captain, one for the first officer. When it's a two-position switch, off and on, when the switch is on, your flight directors will be displayed. In this case, we have the dual Q crosshair flight directors. And if we turn off the flight director, you'll notice that the flight director is now not displayed on the PFD. The command enunciation is still displayed because an autopilot is in command, but the flight director bars have been removed from view. If we turn the flight director switch back on, the flight director bars will be restored and will be redisplayed on the PFD, as we see here. The autothrottle arm switch is an arm off switch. When you turn the autothrottle switch to off, that's a positive disconnect of the autothrottle system. So you can see as we turned it off here, we got the master caution lights. We got the beeper, 1 second on, 10 seconds off. And we got the autothrottle disconnect message on the ICAS alert screen on primary ICAS. You can also see that the FMA went blank under autothrottle. And at this point, we are manual thrust. Anytime you take the autothrottle arm switch and bring it to off, that is a positive disconnect. It will disconnect the autothrottle, and the autothrottle cannot be reconnected as long as the autothrottle arm switch is in off. When we turn the autothrottle switch back to arm, the autothrottle will automatically engage in this case because we're in VNAV path, and the autothrottle will automatically come back into the speed mode, as you can see here when we went to arm. The indicated airspeed Mach selector, you can see in this case we were in VNAV. The indicated airspeed Mach window is blank. We pushed the selector. When you push the selector, that opens the window, and that takes control away from the flight management computer and gives it to the pilot. We remain in VNAV. This is called speed intervention. So what we've done is we've opened the window and we've told the computer, I want to control the speed. You don't control the speed, Mr. Computer. If I want the computer to resume speed control automatically, then I'll push the selector again, the window will blank, and control will go back to the flight management computer. You can see here that I opened the window and automatically it showed me Mach indication. And that's because, remember, we said that the Mach will change to Mach automatically at 0.84, and we're at 0.844. So as a result, it came up as Mach and not indicated airspeed. In this case, if we left the window open and we started a descent, when the indicated airspeed got to approximately 310, it would change back to indicated airspeed automatically. The selector will allow us to select between Mach and indicated airspeed. So if I didn't want Mach, I could simply take the selector, push the button, and it would automatically then change to indicated airspeed. You can see I've done that here. I've switched from Mach to indicated airspeed back to Mach again with that selector. To resume VNAV control, I just push the selector, the window blanks, and now the FMC is controlling speed again. Remember that anytime you make a selection on the mode control panel for a new mode, it's going to show up on the FMA, indicating verification of that mode. So in this case, I pushed altitude, and by pushing the altitude hold push button on the MCP, the airplane went into alt, or altitude hold. The autothrottle went into speed, and we came out of VNAV. So in this case, the FMC is no longer controlling the airplane. We are controlling the airplane directly by maintaining our altitude of 36,000 in this case, since we're level. And the speed light bar illuminated when we're not in VNAV. I don't know if you noticed before, but and this will be covered more in VNAV, but when we were in VNAV, the speed light bar was not illuminated, even though the autothrottle was in speed. When you manually control by not using VNav, the auto throttle will automatically go to the speed mode. The speed light bar will illuminate. So in this case, we've changed the modes, and because we change modes, different light bars are illuminated. In this case, VNav light bar is extinguished, the hold light bar is illuminated, the speed light bar illuminated. We have changes in our FMAs indicating verification of the, in this case, speed and altitude, and we've changed some modes on the mode control panel. Let's take a look at how we can change autopilots. In this case, we were in the left autopilot, and if we want to change to the center autopilot in command, you'll notice that I simply reached up here and pushed the center autopilot. And you'll see it here in a second that if I wanted to change to the right autopilot, I could simply reach up and push right autopilot. This is in the iFly 747-400, and here's another problem with the iFly simulation. That's normally not allowed. You can't just reach up and push a center autopilot and the center autopilot will engage, or push the right autopilot and the right autopilot in command would engage. You have to disconnect an autopilot and then reconnect another autopilot in order to change autopilots. So this is actually a minor problem that's not correct in the iFly 747-400 simulation, and that's that you can reach up here and simply push a selector to change autopilots. You can do it in this model, but in the real simulator or the real airplane, you wouldn't be able to do that. When you push this, nothing would happen. When you push this, nothing would happen, unless you disconnect the autopilot and then reconnect another autopilot. So that is a problem with the simulation. You'll see this is what we actually have to do, and that is disconnect the autopilot and then reconnect another autopilot. So you have to disconnect an autopilot, like the center autopilot, disconnect, and then connect the right autopilot. You have to disconnect and then reconnect. There, we're disconnecting again. We're manually flying now in Flight Director. And then, of course, we can then reconnect another autopilot. To disconnect the autothrottle, there's two ways. The primary method is through the autothrottle disconnect switches. They are thumb switches on the back side of the thrust levers. So as your hand is draped over the 1, 2, 3, and 4 thrust levers, your thumb would be kind of, if you're the captain, your thumb would be dangling in this area. If you're the first officer and you drape your 4 fingers over 1, 2, 3, 4, your left thumb would be kind of dangling in this area. If we wanted to disconnect the autothrottle, we would simply have to reach back slightly with our thumb and push one of the autothrottle disconnect switches. The captain would normally push this one, and the first officer would normally push this one. One push will disconnect the autothrottle. You'll get the autothrottle disconnect, the beeper, and the master caution. And then a second push would remove the master caution and silence the beeper. So similar to the autopilot, it's going to take 2 pushes to disconnect. One push will disconnect, a second push will remove the, in this case, the caution, in the autopilot case, the warnings. You see I just pushed the left switch, and one push disconnected, you heard the beep, 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 and the second push would remove the warning. Similarly, to disconnect the autopilot, one push would disconnect, a second push would silence the siren. We'll disconnect the autopilot again. Notice we're in flight director. We get an autopilot disconnect message, and a second push would silence that warning. Back in command now. Okay, so that completes our discussion on the overview of the mode control panel. As we continue with the Autoflight system, we'll start looking at specifically certain sections of the mode control panel for roll control, pitch control, autothrottle control, and the approach modes. So let's lower the HUD and let's go flying. Until our next briefing, keep the blue side up. Captain Al, out.